I will say that Mark did touch on a lot of issues that we at Melanoma Patients Australia have encountered in the past year particularly, and we were very active in the advocacy to get treatments for advanced melanoma listed on the PBS, and it's really wonderful to be able to work with clinicians like Mark, but then also looking at the clinical trial space and experts like Libby Patton. And Libby is the head of the Australia-New Zealand Melanoma Trials Group based in Sydney. Libby's group has contact with all the clinicians and actually this week hosted a great discussion amongst the researchers and doctors about treatments and these exciting things that Mark has touched upon. We were privileged enough to participate at Melanoma Patients Australia in a consumer forum that Libby's organisation hosted, looking at the patient involvement and interaction in the clinical trial process. And I think that's a really exciting area that Libby's group are looking at. And I'm really pleased to welcome her to the stage today.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's just gone 10 past 12, so I think that I can say that confidently. I'd like to thank Cancer Council Australia and also MPA for the invitation to present today. I think it's really great to also see so many people coming on your Sundays, so thank you for coming. I've been asked to provide an overview of clinical trials, how they work, why are they relevant for melanoma, and so that's how I've designed my presentation today, and I'm sure that the question time will also be available afterwards. So just as an overview for the presentation, I was going to touch on the importance and the purpose of clinical trials, clinical trial design, a history and regulations of trials, and also I've looked into what's currently available, and Mark's touched on that before, just in his presentation, and also just some resources that are available for patients and their families. I think that the programming for today's patient forum has been really great. I think the introduction and presentations earlier today from Pip and David were really useful to be able to contextualise really the amount of work that's gone on in the last 50 years or so. And especially with Professor Heron, I'm not sure if he's still here, but there's certainly been a lot of advances made in the last 50, 60 years in melanoma treatment diagnosis, and a lot of that has also been coming down to the role of clinical trials and research to be able to improve the standard therapies that are available to patients. So I was just going to actually explain what a clinical trial is. I thought it was quite important to explain in many ways that it's not the same as standard medical care, and really, the clinical trials involve people to be able to answer specific health questions. They're typically involving new medicines, also interventions, radiotherapy regimes and surgery, and also medical devices. They're conducted in strictly scientifically controlled settings, and there's very strong, strict regulations surrounding clinical trial management internationally and nationally within Australia. And clinical trials can also be involving tissue. I'm sure many people in this room may have given blood and tissue samples in a trial setting, as well as quality of life research, which is the psychosocial aspects of, very important psychosocial aspects, which are becoming increasingly important with the new medical oncology treatments that are available, and also health economics, which Mark touched on before in terms of actually evaluating the cost of the drug and actually the benefit that it provides to the community, and trying to really rank whether or not and how the government is spending money to be able to spread that across the community. And the other one was the strict regulations that are required to be able to establish medicines through the PBS and through the TGA. So similar to Mark, how he opened and explained some of the terminology for clinical trials, there's lots of words that are used in a clinical trial setting. You generally don't need to worry too much about it, and the people providing your care and your treatment are familiar with them. But clinical trials can be known as research projects, studies. Trial participants can be known as patients, subjects, volunteers, and I'm sure you might actually have a few others that you could put forward. There's many types of clinical trial designs, and I think this is relevant when you're considering what's being tested and why it's being tested. But the overall picture that we're aiming for is to improve treatment and care and to be able to compare therapies against each other to know what works best. So randomised controlled trials, double-blind, single-blind RCTs, which is a placebo, an open label. There's also crossover designs, which are becoming more common, and sequencing and combination trials, which really Mark touched on with reference to the BRAF and the MAC inhibitor trials, which are coming through the pipeline at the moment. And we also have different cohorts that are involved in clinical trials, and that's just trying to balance and address the scientific question in a very structured way. So patients might be treatment naive, and they might be having first, second, and third line of therapy. So the importance of the clinical trials really is that you're trying to determine what is the most appropriate treatment for patients according to their stage of disease. So this is really touching on, I think that the sequencing of today's presentations has been really good. This is the stage of disease as Mark was describing in terms of the local disease and to metastatic stage 4 disease. You're evaluating new treatments, and often you'll be comparing new medicines or therapies with existing therapies or new agents together. You're trying to evaluate the efficacy and the response and to determine the safety. Often scientists and pharmaceutical companies and also clinicians and patients, they may not actually know what the adverse events might be. So that clinical trials are designed to be able to safely monitor what is happening when a patient is given a medicine, so that adverse events are certainly part of what is being looked at, the seriousness and the frequency, so that actually if the medicine gets through all of the different phases of clinical trial and ends up being offered to patients in a clinical setting as standard therapy, they know what's going to happen when the patient has it. So the point of the trials would be also to be defining what is standard therapy for patients, irrespective of the city in which they live, the country in which they're being treated. And so there's actually some drive to actually make common therapies for all patients. So perhaps the question that I'll ask the audience, which would be, why would anyone really want to go on a trial if it's not going to be standard therapy and there's actually some risks and some unknown factors? There's probably some advantages to participating other than for the good of mankind. So I've just actually written some of the potential benefits of participating in trial is that you could actually be randomised to a treatment that you want. And this is especially relevant at the moment with some of the high-cost drugs that are available. In a clinical trial setting, patients wouldn't necessarily be asked to foot the bill for those products, so that actually some of the medical oncology trials at the moment, it is actually an opportunity and a window to be randomised to a trial that would otherwise cost over $100,000 a year to actually have access to. So you may actually get a benefit also of some of these investigative agents. So if we don't know what happens in some of the early phase studies, by actually being randomised and participating in a study, you might actually get some benefit. So the treatments might actually be better than you expected. Often in a clinical trial, it's a very strict setting. There's a clinical protocol with strict patient visits and follow-up, but actually you'll be receiving likely more frequent follow-up than you otherwise might have in standard care. And if you have more frequent follow-up, according to the protocol, it's likely also that you'll see your doctor more often, that you'll see the study coordinators more often, and that actually you actually are being monitored more regularly than you might otherwise be. I think there were some questions earlier this morning about some of the standard follow-up schedules that are available, and at the moment in Australia there are certain recommendations of how frequently you would be recommended to see your oncologist for follow-up. But that differs around the world, and there's certainly differences between different clinicians, so that the standard schedule of a clinical trial would mean that you're back at the clinic as per protocol. Another benefit would be that you're actively engaged in your healthcare, that you're actually, there's altruistic aspects of actually serving research and actually trying to provide information and benefit to people who may be diagnosed in the future. And so some of the downsides actually of clinical trial participation is that you might be randomised to a treatment that you don't want. Obviously there could be greater anxiety, primarily because you're in it's an unknown setting. You don't actually know what the outcomes are going to clearly be. The more frequent follow-up means that actually you need to be at the hospital more frequently than you may want to be. So that is challenging for family and friends to be able to, or if you're travelling back and forth to the clinic, it does take a lot of time and effort. So a lot of the clinical trial designs may actually involve a placebo arm where there will be like a sugar tablet. So you may actually not even receive a direct benefit, but the sugar tablet generally you won't know, and it's really up to the regular monitoring of your doctor to be in touch with you about how your health is and whether or not there's any changes. Often with a clinical trial design and a protocol, you're not going to be able to change treatment arms. That's changing now. Some of the new trials have got crossover design, which means that if there's progression, the patient can cross over to the active treatment. But essentially for the standard traditional view of clinical trials is the treatment arms are pretty strict. And the reason for that is that they're trying to monitor what happens over a course of time for different patients on receiving a specific treatment. And the other thing which perhaps Mark has touched on is that actually results of clinical trials may not be known for a long time. So you give up a lot of effort and a lot of time and you've actually been willingly engaging in your healthcare, but the publication of the data might be hard to find or it may actually be not available for quite a while. So just touching, I think I've sort of expressed some of this, but it's important to point out that clinical trials are different to standard medical care. Clinical trials are just research. They're questions that are being asked when the answers are unknown. They follow a strict protocol. Generally, there's case report forms that need to be filled in so that actually there's this very standardised procedure of a study visit which takes place. It's a strictly regulated environment which has got international guidelines and recommendations which are being followed. And generally, as part of a clinical trial, there's responsibilities of different people within the hospital and also generally other organisations that will be involved in your care or involved at least in the clinical trial. There may be some more risks to the patient because some of the outcomes are unknown. And this is a little bit repeated in terms of the frequency of follow-up might be different in standard of care setting. And the other difference is actually that there's ongoing independent review of all clinical trials. There's lots of watchdogs that are in place. Therapeutic Goods Administration, every institution also has an ethics committee. So the sponsors of clinical trials are required to do frequent reporting of what's actually happening on the ground at each of the trial sites, what's happening to the patients, and reporting that to the appropriate authority if anything's not if anything, well, we have to report every 6 to 12 months on what's actually happening. So just touching on what types of trials there are, this is sort of a nice summary of some of the presentations earlier today in terms of the treatment trials, which really I think reflects back to John Heron's presentation of how some of the care, he was doing surgery in the 50s and 60s and still surgery remains the mainstay of melanoma treatment. But it's through clinical trials that we've been able to develop different types of treatments for patients. Prevention trials and the screening trials really support some of the work that David and Pip have presented this morning, which has really shaped the way that we understand melanoma presentation and how to actually manage diagnosis and screening sensibly. Diagnostic trials, and then the quality of life trials, which is more psychosocial aspects of the experience of the people affected by the disease. In addition to Mark's discussion on the level and the stage of disease, I'm going to introduce a new term which would be phase. And the phases of clinical trial development really, this is the language that is used around the world to describe the different types of trials that are being undertaken. And there's 4 phases. So this is the first phase, phase 1, and that's really safety. These are the first in human clinical trials that are conducted, and what would end up happening typically with medical oncology, like some of the new agents that are coming through, is that they've been developed in a laboratory, often by a pharmaceutical company. By the time you get to a phase 1 study, you've had lots of molecules that have fallen off the wagon. They didn't show any work in any of the animal studies, so they've not been progressed further. But by the time you come to a phase 1 study, you'll be the first in human trial. You've got a molecule that you think works well, you understand what it does in an animal model, and you're now wanting to try and pilot and find out what actually happens in people. So normally small sample size of 20 to 100 patients, but some of the new medical oncology melanoma trials have got really big sample sizes of a couple of hundred patients. And really you're trying to work out what happens when a person takes this medicine. What are the doses? Also, you don't know how much dose to give and the frequency. So that's sort of very preliminary work that you're trying to look at. The second phase is actually looking at the efficacy of what actually happens. You may have a better understanding of what the dose and frequency is, so you know what's probably a sensible amount of medicine to give. The cost of the phase 2, this is increasing cost because your sample sizes are getting bigger. And you're really trying to observe what actually happens and how does the drug work. Is it feasible? You're trying to evaluate more confidently with the dosing and the frequency. And then the third phase is the largest phase of clinical trial testing prior to registration. And at this point, you actually have a drug, a medicine, or you have a technique. You know the side effects are pretty are well known and well documented, but you're trying to actually evaluate what actually happens when more people take it. So the size varies. I mean, this says 1,000 to 2,000. I know ANZ MTG is currently running a few phase 3 trials, and they're smaller than that. But you've also got a phase 3 trial where you're looking at the new treatment compared to what exists as the standard therapy. And then after phase 3, if you end up completing, you've got your molecule in phase 1, you work out what the dose and the frequency is, and you understand some of the basic safety parameters. It goes into phase 2 testing, and you're looking actually more broadly at what happens when more people take it. Phase 3 and phase 2, you've also got some safety data coming in. Phase 3 is where it's a larger evaluation of the safety and the efficacy and what are the response rates to the new treatment. And then actually phase 4 is by the time phase 3 is completed, you'll actually have a degree of confidence that it's a good agent or a good technique and that it should be recommended for standard of care, or it should actually be put forward for registration on the TGA and made available to patients. So a lot of the agents that Mark was referring to with the inhibitors and some of the immunotherapies are currently between stage, well, we've got all phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trials open in that. And what would happen, we would assume, is that phase 3 trials would be completed and applications would be made to the TGA for listing. But phase 4 studies, back to this, is post-marketing. This is often where much broader, normally the medicine would be available on the TGA by this stage, and you're actually trying to do really larger study cohorts with a lot more patients. And you're collecting all of that data, but you've got a good understanding of what's going to be happening in the general population. So I thought maybe opening up the conversation a bit, it would be good to describe that the clinical trial team is actually more than the doctor and the nurse and the patient. There's a whole infrastructure of how clinical trials are being conducted, and at the moment there's lots of different people. I'm a bit disappointed I actually didn't put some photos in here because I work with lots of different clinical trial teams and people, but we've got some anonymised figures and cartoons. So, but we've got it. Normally, there will always be a sponsor who may also be the funder. There's lots of regulatory and governance arrangements in place in any country that's doing trials, and in Australia, it's the Therapeutic Goods Administration. We have the patients with the support of their family members and friends, hospital sites, and hospitals and the clinics are often referred to as a site. And you have principal and co-investigators who are typically the doctors, nursing staff, allied health staff, and data managers. And as I referred to earlier, there's independent review. And so we end up having the Human Research Ethics Committee and the governance officers, as well as the Data Safety Monitoring Committee, which is normally an independent body which is reviewing the safety data that's coming in to the sponsor of the trial that's being undertaken. So trial sponsors have overall responsibility for every trial, and the sponsor can really depend. It can be an academic, a doctor, could be a hospital, an area health service, an NGO, Could also be a cancer cooperative research group, just like ANZ MTG, or it could be a company, a pharmaceutical company, GSK, Roche, BMS. They're all running trials at the moment. They're all sponsors. But the important thing about the sponsor is that they're fully responsible for the clinical trial, for the training, the education, the data management, protecting the patient in case of anything going awry. And they have contracts issued between all of the different stakeholders, and normally the sponsor is responsible for issuing the contracts and adhering to the international regulations appropriately. So I've explained that there are strict regulations and guidelines in place internationally. Most recently, as part of, in the 20th century, more of the formal legislation for clinical trial practice has been established, namely following the Second World War. And the International Conference on Harmonisation and Guidelines of Good Clinical Practice, also known as ICH-GCP, was established in the Geneva Convention following World War II. And the Australian regulations have been really modified based on the recommendations of ICH-GCP, so that we have a number of other regulations in place. And anyone to do with clinical trials involving the ethics committees, the patients, the doctors, the sponsors, adhere to these codes. So in Australia, this is the NHMRC national statement, which ethics committees and all parties involved in trials actually follows. This is reviewed regularly and updated. So most recent update I could find was in May 2013. But the general principle of GCP is that the rights and well-being of patients is the most important consideration of any clinical trial, that the patient freely gives their informed consent prior to participating voluntarily in the study. That includes withdrawing consent as well at any time, and that wouldn't affect their care. Confidentiality and privacy is to be protected. So if you are participating in a trial, your personal details will never be shared with the sponsor. It's all de-identified, and trial reports and any summaries would never actually include any personal details. GCP also ensures that the validity and credibility of the research that's being undertaken is proper, and that any medicines or devices which are used in a clinical trial setting have been developed safely and appropriately according to the well, in this case, the GMP, which is Australia's regulations for good manufacturing practice. This is just touching on the watchdog which Australia reports to, which is the TGA. So there's 2 clinical trial schemes for new medicines and new devices, and that's the sponsor needs to submit a CTN form or a CTX form to be able to set up those trials. And it's the sponsor's responsibility to follow that. With the TGA, they've also got strict timelines for reporting any safety events and whatnot. Yeah. So just moving on, special access. I'll just move through. Mark touched on the approving and subsidising of drugs through the PBAC. This is just an overview of the current melanoma clinical trials. In preparation for the presentation, I went through the clinical trials. There's a couple of registries that are available that list different clinical trials that are open and recruiting in the States and Australia. So we end up having, I did some searches actually and found out how many studies for melanoma are listed as a starting point. So clinicaltrials.gov is the US site with just over 1,400 trials. The ANZ CTR has 183 melanoma trials listed, and the Australian Cancer Trials had just over 1,900 cancer trials and 68 melanoma trials, which is about 3.5% of all of the cancer trials in Australia would be melanoma. There's also other clinical trial registries available online, which is the Cancer Councils, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland and WA have got registries listing them. New Zealand has a new clinical trials portal which was launched this year. And all of the trials that are listed are really in different melanoma therapies. So as Mark was explaining, the local therapies and then some of the systemic therapies. Quality of life and imaging studies are also underway. But for the purposes of this presentation, I actually looked at the Australian Cancer Trials website, which you can go and search, and there's a drop-down menu where you can select melanoma. And I looked through and tried to work out what's open. And I work in this field, and I appreciate that I had to spend quite a few hours trying to collate the information and interpret it in a way that was sensible. And I've been working in this field for a while, so I did. It's a common thing that I speak, and I've heard many times in various conversations, that it's really hard to know what's available. So at the moment, of the 68 trials that were listed for melanoma, I can confirm that there's actually only 66, because there were 2 repeat entries. The specific types of cancer under investigation under the melanoma subheading was actually only 53 of them were melanoma specific, and the rest also included other solid tumours and also non-melanoma skin cancers. There are 33 open trials that were listed. There are 7 projects that are actually listed as upcoming, including some of the trials that Mark referred to, which is the combination of the sequencing trials and the medical oncology. Not all are listed. Not everyone has to list here. It's just an obligation as a sponsor that you're encouraged to list your information freely and availably on a public domain. So the types of intervention was 51 treatment trials that were listed. There are 11 screening and prevention trials and 4 psychosocial projects underway. I was interested that the split was about 50-50 in terms of the academic and the pharmaceutical company list, and there was over a third were doing single institution protocols, which you would assume are the early phase 1 trials with a small sample size. And there were 17 multi-centre phase 3 trials listed, which are the larger big recruiting studies, all in melanoma. So I thought that this was useful, but even I was able to identify some discrepancies based on what I know, which I corrected for this presentation. So it's hard to know which hospitals are running melanoma clinical trials, but I could give you a general overview of our current activity within ANZ MTG. So we've got 599 full Australian members. So full members are all doctors and research staff, and there's 42 hospitals in that group. Of the 42 hospitals, there are 17 hospitals nationally that are actually randomising and recruiting clinical trials, ANZ MTG's clinical trials. So I can't speak on behalf of other sponsors in terms of the number of trial sites that they're working with, but I could present that information. And maybe in closing, I really just wanted to be able to touch on, encourage everyone to be really proactive and to be curious as to whether or not there's a suitable clinical trial that might be available to them, and to be able to ask your doctors about it. I think also in clinical trial preparation, there's inclusion and exclusion criteria that actually need to be passed, so just know that in advance that not everyone can get on, and that there's major melanoma units in every state that you could always, anyways, that would have all of and most of the clinical trials open. And as I'm sure you're all already doing, but it would be to actually reach out for support through the different support networks, for example, MPA, for more information. This is just an overview in terms of some of the patient resources that are available on the ANZ MTG website. And it also just lists all of the contact details for MPA, Cancer Council in all of the different states, and some of the other support, some of the other centres that are running support groups. So that's I think that's in closing. And this is actually some of the team that I work with. So I just thought I'd include them in photos. But thanks for your time, everyone.